The rain came in sometime after supper. I could hear it on the roof before I even understood what the sound was. That slow, steady percussion of drops on old shingles. The kind of sound that settles into you and makes you feel that nowhere else in the world quite exists tonight. Just this room, just this lamp, just the two of us, if you found your way here and made yourself comfortable. My name is Eleanor. I was born in 1931 in a farmhouse outside a little town called Mill Haven, Ohio, though I don't suppose you'd find that name on any map drawn after 1960, when the county redrew its lines and renamed half the crossroads. Mill Haven is gone now, the way a lot of small places went. But the house I grew up in stood at the end of a gravel road, and beyond it there was a field, and beyond the field there was a woodlot, and in winter you could see the pale line of the sky through the bare trees, and that was the whole world as far as I was concerned. I'm 92 years old now, or near enough. I don't count the months too carefully anymore. There comes a point in a long life when the arithmetic of it matters less than the texture. What it felt like to be inside those years, what the light was like, what the air smelled like in a particular season. That's what I tend to think about in the evenings, especially on a night like this one, when the rain is on the roof and there's nowhere I need to be. I've been sitting here tonight thinking about kitchens, about the one I grew up in and the ones I've had since, and then, almost against my will, the way memories arrive sometimes, about the strangest fact I ever learned. It has to do with Newport, Rhode Island, and a world so different from the one I knew that even now, all these years later, I find it strange to hold in my mind. I'll tell you about it as we go. The rain has been coming since about 4 o'clock this afternoon, which is a long rain, the kind that settles in for the evening and possibly the night. I don't mind it. I've been in this apartment long enough to know how the rain sounds against the different windows. This window, the one to my left where the lamp is, has a sound I've known for 30 years. It is at this point one of the sounds of home. I made bean soup for supper tonight. Navy beans, a ham hock, an onion, dried thyme from the tin on the shelf. It has been on the stove since noon, low and slow, and the apartment smelled like it all afternoon. That warm, substantial smell that is not fancy and does not try to be. My mother's soup. Her mother's before that, I expect, though I never knew my grandmother well enough to know what she cooked. But the recipe came from somewhere, and that somewhere was very likely a farmhouse kitchen not unlike the one I grew up in, and the women who cooked it were women not unlike my mother. I've been sitting with that thought lately. The unbroken line of kitchen work that leads from somewhere in the past to here, to this small apartment, to the soup pot that I washed and put in the rack an hour ago. I am the latest keeper of a practice that is older than anything I've read about. Not the specific recipe necessarily, but the practice. The daily, undramatic, sustaining work. The Newport Hostesses. I've been thinking about all my life, and I will tell you about them tonight. I've been planning this telling for longer than I can say. Did not have that practice. They were arranged, by the world they lived in and the architecture of their houses, to be without it. The kitchen was not their domain. In certain formal senses, the kitchen was not supposed to exist in the same building they occupied. The food appeared at their tables the way furniture appeared in their rooms, ordered from somewhere else, managed by someone else, produced by invisible hands. I'm here to tell you about those invisible hands, and about the very visible hands of my mother at the Monarch stove in Mill Haven, Ohio, in the kitchen that smelled like bread. Come then, get comfortable. Let the room go soft around you, the way a room does when you've stopped needing anything from it. But you don't have to follow every word. You don't have to stay awake to hear where the story goes. If you find yourself drifting, let yourself go. The story will still be here, and so will I, and the rain isn't going anywhere tonight. Let me start at the beginning, the way I always do when there's nothing pressing and nowhere to be. Let me start with the house. The house wasn't much, from the outside. A 2-story farmhouse with white paint that had gone grey in patches, a porch that sagged a little on the right side where one of the posts had settled in the wet ground, and 3 windows across the front that always seemed to catch the afternoon light in a particular way. Golden, somehow, even in October, even when the weather was closing in. My mother used to say it was the only thing that house did elegantly, the way it held the afternoon light. I think she was right. I think she said it to remind herself that the house had something worth keeping. Inside was different. The kitchen was at the back of the house, the way farmhouse kitchens always were in those days. You came in through the mudroom, a small room with hooks for coats and a bench for boots, and a smell that was half wet wool and half something older, earthier, some accumulated residue of all the winters that had ever passed through that door. Then you pushed through another door, and the kitchen opened up around you, and the smell changed entirely. My mother's kitchen smelled like bread, mostly. Not just when there was bread in the oven, though that was a particular and concentrated version of the smell. A smell that filled every corner and made you feel warm from the inside out, even when the temperature outside was well below freezing. It smelled like bread all the time, I think, because the flour was always there, a 50-pound cotton sack that sat in the corner beside the stove, and the yeast, and the particular warmth that a wood stove puts into a room. A wood stove doesn't just warm the way central heating does. It creates a living warmth, radiating from the cast iron, humming faintly when the fire was good and hot, ticking and settling as it cooled in the early morning hours. Our stove was a monarch, black and heavy, with chrome trim that my mother polished every Saturday morning whether it needed it or not. 6 burner plates, an oven with a temperature dial that had stopped working sometime before my birth and had never been repaired. My mother knew that oven the way you know an old friend, knew by the smell and the sound when it was at the right heat for biscuits versus the right heat for a roasting chicken. She rarely used the dial even when it worked, is my understanding. What she had instead was experience, accumulated over so many years of standing at that stove that she'd learned to read its moods the way a sailor learns to read weather. The kitchen table was in the centre of the room. Not fancy, just pine, solid and thick, with 4 mismatched chairs that had been acquired one at a time over the years as other chairs wore out. The table was where everything happened. My father ate his breakfast there before daylight in the winter months, when he'd have to be out in the barn before the sun was up. My mother sat there in the afternoon with her coffee, which she drank black and without sugar, a habit she'd had since before I could remember. My brother Tommy and I did our schoolwork there in the evenings, spreading our books and papers across one end while my mother moved quietly at the other end, finishing the dishes or mending something by the light of the lamp. We had electricity by then, for most of my childhood. The county had brought the lines through in 1934 or thereabouts, and we had a single bulb in each room, but the kitchen light was positioned in the centre of the ceiling, and in the evenings the light it cast was poor for close work. My mother kept a kerosene lamp on the table for practical reasons, and long after we had electricity, that lamp stayed on the table, lit every evening at dusk, as much from habit as necessity. I associate the smell of kerosene with doing arithmetic. I don't think I will ever separate the two. The linoleum on the kitchen floor was a pattern of blue and white diamonds that I could describe to you exactly, every detail of, if you asked me to close my eyes and see it. That floor. I must have looked at it 10,000 times, sitting at the table, standing at the counter, sweeping it on Saturdays, lying on it once or twice as a small child, just because the coolness of it felt good in summer. In winter, my mother laid down a braided rug near the stove, made from strips of old coats and dresses that had worn out. It was brown and red and a greyish-purple that might once have been blue. That rug is one of those things I see very clearly still, in certain kinds of dreams. My mother. Let me tell you about my mother, because to understand the kitchen you have to understand her. Her name was Grace. She was born in 1904, in the same county, the daughter of a farmer, and she'd married my father at 19 and moved into this house, and had 3 children, of whom I was the middle one. She was not a tall woman, not quite 5'2". With dark hair she wore pinned up and hands that were always doing something. Those hands. I never saw my mother's hands still during the day. They were either kneading or stirring or mending or carrying, and in the evenings when she sat they rested in her lap for no more than a minute before they found something. A stocking to darn, a button to sew back on, a dishcloth to fold. She cooked 3 meals a day, every day of her adult life, from the time she married at 19 until she was in her 80s, and my brother Tommy finally convinced her she didn't have to do it all herself. She never complained about it. It wasn't that she loved cooking particularly, or hated it. It was simply the work, the daily work, the work that kept us fed and warm and alive. She approached it the way she approached everything, steadily, efficiently, without drama. But there were meals that were more than work. Sunday dinner, for instance. My mother started Sunday dinner on Saturday evening, or sometimes even Friday, depending on what she was making. If it was a roast, a chicken or a small pork roast if my father had sold something at the market and we were feeling prosperous, she would have been thinking about it since the week before, planning around the garden and the root cellar and whatever had come in from the neighbours in trade. Cooking in those years was a kind of chess game, I understand now. You were always thinking several moves ahead. On Sunday mornings in winter, the kitchen was warm before the rest of the house. My mother was always up first. You could hear her in the kitchen from my bedroom above, the sound of the stove being stoked, the squeak of the bread box, the tap of water running. By the time the rest of us came downstairs, the kitchen was the only warm room in the house, and we'd cluster near the stove, all three of us children in our nightclothes, and my mother would be already dressed, already working, already an hour into her day. The pantry was off the kitchen, a small cold room with shelves on three sides. In autumn, after canning season, those shelves were full, jars of tomatoes and green beans and corn and the pale gold peaches my mother put up every August when the Henderson's trees came in, and pickled beets and applesauce and watermelon rain preserves that we ate with cold pork and didn't think of as a luxury because it was simply what you did with watermelon rinds. She had a particular pride in the pantry in October. She'd open the door and look at those rows of jars sometimes, just look, and then close it again without saying anything. I understood even then that this was a kind of satisfaction, the proof that we would eat through another winter. My grandmother, my mother's mother, came to visit every summer for 2 or 3 weeks. She was a small, very quiet woman who moved through the kitchen as though she'd helped design it, fitting herself around my mother's routines without effort or instruction. The two of them cooked together in a way I've rarely seen two adults share a space, without negotiating, without asking, each moving out of the other's path before the need arose. I used to watch them and wonder when that happened, that knowing without words, and decide it must take about 40 years. I was right, as it turned out it does. The smells of that kitchen. I think about them often, now that I'm old enough to know how much time does to memory, polishing some things until they shine and letting others fade almost entirely. The smell of the kitchen on a cold morning, wood smoke, the metallic smell of the cast iron heating up, coffee just coming to the boil, the smell of biscuit dough, that soft, yeasty, warm smell that is like nothing else in the world, the smell of lard rendering in the skillet, the smell of onions in butter, which is a smell that still, to this day, undoes me in a way that I don't have words for. I'd like you to try to imagine it. The way that kitchen was the whole centre of a life, the warmth of it in winter, the industry of it all year round, the way every good thing in our lives seemed to originate there, meals and warmth and conversation, and the simple fact of being fed. It was never fancy. We never had enough, not really, though I didn't understand that as a child. But it was ours, and my mother filled it every day with her labour and her quiet competence. I'm telling you all of this because of what I eventually learned about the Newport cottages, those enormous summer mansions in Rhode Island that the newspapers called cottages, with a kind of irony that nobody who built them intended. I'll get there. But to understand what astonished me about those houses, you have to start here. You have to start in my mother's kitchen, with the monarch stove and the blue and white linoleum and the flour sack in the corner, and understand what a kitchen meant in the world I came from. Because in my world, a kitchen was everything, and in Newport, for those few gilded decades at the turn of the century, a kitchen in the great house, in the mistress's house, was not allowed, was an absence, was something that was in certain formal and binding ways prohibited from being there at all. I'll tell you how I came to understand that, but not yet. For now, let me stay here a little while longer. The blue diamonds on the floor, the kettle on the back burner, the smell of bread. That winter taught me something I couldn't have named at the time. I was 2 or 3 years old when the worst of it began, so my first memories of the Depression are not really memories of hardship. They are memories of the texture of hardship, the way it felt from inside a small child's life, which is to say, normal. The adjustments my parents made, the worrying they did, the calculations that governed every purchase and every meal, all of that happened above my head, in the adult world, and what filtered down to me was simply the way things were. What I remember from those early years of the 1930s is the bean soup. My mother made bean soup the way some women keep a fire going, constantly, continuously, adding to what was there rather than starting fresh. There was always a pot of something on the back of the stove, usually beans, navy beans mostly, though sometimes there were pintos or Great Northerns from the garden. She'd soak them overnight, start them in the morning, and by afternoon the kitchen would be full of a soft, starchy, beany smell that I associated then and associate still with the feeling of being inside and warm when the world outside was cold. The soup would go for days. She'd add water as the level dropped, a bit more salt pork if there was any, an onion if we had one, bread on the side, always bread, and maybe a jar of tomatoes she'd put up from the summer garden. That was dinner, most nights in winter. Bean soup and bread, and if we were lucky, something sweet at the end, a bit of honey or a dish of applesauce canned in September. I didn't know to be hungry for anything else. That's the thing about childhood deprivation that I've turned over in my mind many times since. You don't know what you don't have. I didn't know there were children eating meat every night, or that some families bought bread at the store instead of baking it, or that in certain houses there was always enough and then more than enough. I knew what our table had, and our table had plenty of warm soup and good bread, and my mother's hands moving across the stove, and that felt like abundance. What I did understand, even then, even young, was that my mother was careful. There is a particular quality of carefulness that belongs to that era and that class of people, and I recognized it without naming it. The way she measured the flour, levelling the cup with a knife, and looking at it critically before she tipped it into the bowl. The way she scraped the last of everything out of every container. The honey jar held over the heat until the last amber drop came loose. The butter wrapper used to grease the pan so nothing was wasted. The way she watched the fire in the stove, because wood cost something to cut and haul, and a fire that burned too hot was a fire burning money. My father worked whenever he could find work. He was a farmer. That was what he was, what his father had been, what he knew how to do. But the farm was small and the years were hard, and the prices for the things he raised were so low through most of the 30s that farming alone didn't keep us. He did other things, hauled wood, helped neighbours with their harvests, did carpentry work, once spent 6 weeks in the autumn helping to build a road for the county. When he came home from work, he was tired in a way I recognised even as a child. Not just physically tired, but worn down in a deeper place. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. He ate whatever my mother put in front of him without comment or complaint. That was his code. To eat what was given to you and not ask for more and be grateful for what there was. My father was not a man who talked a great deal about how he felt about things. He showed it in other ways, in the way he sat at the table with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup very still, before supper was ready, as if the warmth of the cup was something he needed. In the way he looked at my mother sometimes, a quick look across the kitchen, something passing between them that I was too young to understand but old enough to feel was important. The price of things in those years. Flour was about 5 cents a pound. A pound of salt pork might be 10 cents on a good day. Coffee was perhaps 25 or 30 cents a pound, and my mother considered coffee a necessity in a way she did not consider most things necessities. A dozen eggs when the hens were laying were maybe 15 cents at the store, but we had our own hens, so eggs were what we had when we had them. Lard came from the full hog killing, which my father did every November, the cold, smoky smell of it rising in the yard while my mother stood at the big outdoor kettle and rendered what they'd need for the year. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was allowed to be wasted. There was a family on the road past ours, the Hendersons, who had it worse than we did. 4 children and a father who had been ill for 2 winters, and a mother who was doing the best she could with what seemed like almost nothing. My mother sent soup over to the Hendersons in the worst winters. She'd ladle a quart of the bean soup into a jar, put a cloth over it, and send my brother Tommy down the road with it. She never made any particular ceremony of this, and she didn't talk about it. It was just a thing you did. You had a little more than someone else, and you sent them soup. I went with Tommy once, on a soup delivery in February of 1936 or 1937. I remember the cold, a different kind of cold than most winters, a cold that came from a particular direction and had a smell to it. Metallic, insistent, the kind of cold that makes you understand why people in those years were frightened of winter. The Henderson house was smaller than ours, colder, the stove not as good. But it was a kitchen, a real kitchen, a centre. Mrs. Henderson was at her own stove when we came in, a pot of something on the back burner, her 4 children clustering near the heat the way children do when there's not enough of it. She thanked my mother through us without making it into more than it was. "Tell Grace I said thank you." That was all. That was the whole of it. I've thought about Mrs. Henderson often over the years, when I've thought about those Newport cottages. The contrast seems almost theatrical when you lay them side by side. Mrs. Henderson in her cold kitchen, her sick husband, her 4 children, her pot of something on the back burner. And in another world entirely, a woman in a gown worth more than everything the Hendersons owned, presiding over a dinner table set with orchids and crystal and silver, eating food produced somewhere underground by a staff of professional French chefs. Both of them women, both of them responsible in different ways for feeding people, and the distance between them so vast as to seem like a different species of life. But I didn't understand any of that yet. I was 5, 6, 7 years old. I knew the bean soup and the bread and the blue and white linoleum floor. I knew Tommy's shoes wore out faster than my parents could replace them, and that my mother cut down her old dresses to make clothes for me, and that Christmas was an orange and a paper packet of hard candy and 1 gift apiece, carefully chosen. And I knew that the year the roof leaked and my father couldn't fix it until spring, my mother set pots under the drips without complaint and went to bed and came back in the morning and made breakfast, and that was that. There were good things too. I want to be clear about this, because when I look back on those years now, what I feel is not sorrow. There were hard things, and they were genuinely hard, and there was privation I didn't recognise as privation until I was older. But there was also the warmth of the kitchen in winter, the particular pleasure of a meal that tasted good precisely because you were hungry and cold, and this was warm and substantial. The Sunday chicken, maybe twice a month in good years, less than that in bad ones, which my mother roasted slowly with potatoes and the dried herbs she kept in small tins on the pantry shelf, and which I still consider the best meal I have ever eaten, though I have eaten many meals since that were far more expensive and far less memorable. There was also the radio. My father brought home a Zenith console in 1935 or thereabouts, a second-hand purchase from a man in town who was moving away, and it sat in the front room and became the voice of the larger world. On evenings when supper was done and the dishes were washed and the children were at the table with their schoolwork, my father would reach over and turn it on, and the static would clear, and there would be music, or a drama, or the news. The news I didn't understand very well yet. It was about places on the globe at school, about things happening far away. But the music I understood immediately and completely. There was a Saturday evening programme of old songs, the kinds of songs my mother's mother had known, hymns and ballads and the early popular songs of a previous century. And on those Saturday evenings my mother would sometimes stop what she was doing and stand at the kitchen door listening, and her face would have a quality I couldn't name but that I associated with something like rest, as if the music was giving her something she needed that the work couldn't. She sang sometimes, while she cooked. Not often, and not self-consciously, just a line or two of something, the way you hum a tune you've been carrying in your head, absent-mindedly, privately. I don't think she knew I was watching. I don't think she was performing for anyone. She was just a woman at a stove singing a bar of "Shall We Gather at the River" because it had come into her head, and then stopping and going back to whatever she was stirring. I keep that image very clearly, more clearly than many things. Her back to me, the pot in front of her, the stove throwing its warmth, and that brief measure of him floating up and then stopping. I keep it because it seems to contain something true about her, about the way the work and the private life were woven together in that kitchen, inseparable, the labour and the feeling occurring in the same space at the same time. The Newport Hostesses had no such thing. Their labour was not their own. It was someone else's, performed out of sight, the product arriving at the table as if from another world, and their private life, their inner life, was performed too. For guests, for society, for the daily scrutiny of a world that judged women by their appearance and their accomplishments and their social standing. I wonder sometimes whether they ever sang to themselves while doing something, whether there was any room for that in those arrangements. I suspect there wasn't. I suspect that the hiding of the kitchen hid something else too. There was more to that year, but it belongs to a quieter night than this one. I started school in 1936 at 5 years old. The schoolhouse was 2 miles from our farm, and in good weather I walked it with Tommy, who was 4 years older, and regarded me with the tolerant exasperation of an older sibling who has been assigned a responsibility he didn't ask for. In bad weather, my father drove us in the truck, or sometimes, in the deepest winter, we didn't go at all, and my mother kept us home, and we did reading at the kitchen table while the storm came in. The school was 1 room, 8 grades, 22 children in the year I started. The teacher was a woman named Miss Caldwell, who was, to my 5-year-old eyes, approximately 40 years old, though she was probably 25. She had brown hair and wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, and had a way of explaining things that made me feel, when she talked, that the world was larger and more interesting than I'd known. She had a globe on her desk, one of those old globes with the countries in faded pastels, the United States a pale yellow, the oceans a faded blue. In the afternoon, when the younger children were doing their arithmetic and the older ones were reading, she would sometimes take the globe down from its stand and spin it gently and tell us something about a place on it. Not a lesson exactly, just a story. "This is where they have elephants," she'd say, touching a finger to Africa. "This is where the pyramids are that we read about in your reader last week. This is the Pacific Ocean, and it's so large that our whole country would fit inside it 3 times over." I was 6 years old the first time she mentioned Newport. She was telling us about Rhode Island, the smallest state, she said, which always makes children pay attention. Anything that's the smallest or the biggest or the first. And she said that Newport, Rhode Island, had once been the place where the wealthiest people in America went in the summer, and they built houses there so large and so grand that they called them cottages. She smiled when she said the word, that small, private smile that meant the thing she was telling us was a little bit absurd. "How large?" I asked. I was in the front row. I was always in the front row. "Well," Miss Caldwell said, "one of them, the one the Vanderbilt family built called the Breakers, had about 70 rooms. I looked at my brother Tommy, who was in the 3rd row doing long division. He wasn't paying attention. I tried to count to 70 in my head, thinking about rooms. Our house had 8 rooms, counting the attic. 70 rooms. I couldn't hold the number in a way that meant anything concrete. I kept dividing our house into itself and not getting anywhere near 70. "How many people lived in it?" I asked. "That's the interesting part," Miss Caldwell said. "For most of the year no one lived in it at all, and in the summer when the family came there might be a dozen family members and perhaps 50 or 60 servants." 50 or 60 servants. I thought about Mr. and Mrs. Henley, who lived in the nice house at the end of the main road into town, who were the wealthiest people I knew of in our area. They had a woman who came in twice a week to clean. That was what servants meant to me, 1 woman, twice a week. 50 or 60 was a number I could not connect to anything in my experience. I went home that afternoon and told my mother what Miss Caldwell had said. My mother was at the stove when I told her. When was she not at the stove in the afternoon? And she listened with her back to me, stirring something. "That's Newport for you," she said. "Did you know about it?" "I've read about it. In the Ladies' Home Journal, years ago." She turned then, wiping her hands on her apron. "There was a woman I knew of before I was married, a cousin of your grandmother's, very distant, who went to work in one of those houses one summer. The summer work, they called it. When the families came to Newport for the season, they needed more help than usual, and they'd hire seasonal staff." "What was it like?" I asked. My mother looked at the window, thoughtful. From what she said, it was like working inside a strange country. Everything was different. Everything was done in a particular way, and you had to learn the way before you could do anything at all. She paused. She said the kitchens were underground. "Underground?" "Some of them. Not literally underground, but in the basement, or in a building connected to the main house by a passage, or out in a separate wing. The idea was that the family shouldn't know where their food came from. It appeared at the table, that was all. The preparation, that was invisible. That was supposed to be invisible." I thought about this all through supper that evening, about food appearing at a table without anyone knowing where it came from, about a kitchen hidden underground full of cooks who were not supposed to be seen. My mother's kitchen was the opposite of that. You could not enter our house without knowing immediately that there was a kitchen in it. The smell reached you before you'd even gotten through the mudroom. In the weeks and months after that conversation, I asked Miss Caldwell more questions about Newport whenever I could arrange it without appearing peculiar. She was patient with me about this. She brought in a magazine one afternoon, a copy of the Saturday Evening Post from several years before with photographs of some of the Newport estates, and let me look at it at the lunch hour. The photographs showed the houses from the front, those enormous facades, the manicured grounds, the scale of them impossible to fully comprehend. There was one photograph of the interior of a dining room, a room that seemed to go on longer than our entire house, with a painted ceiling and enormous windows, and a table set for what looked like 20 people or more. I studied that photograph for a long time. I tried to imagine sitting at that table, eating food that appeared from nowhere. I couldn't quite do it. My imagination kept putting my mother into the picture, somewhere, with her apron on, which I knew was wrong. But I couldn't help it. Food had to come from somewhere. It had to come from someone's hands. We had the radio by then, the Zenith console in the corner of the front room. On Sunday evenings my father would turn it on after supper, and the family would gather in the front room, and for an hour or two the world came in. News from places on Miss Caldwell's globe. Music. Dramas. A farm report that my father listened to with a concentrated attention he gave to anything that might affect the price of corn. That winter the radio carried a program I've never forgotten. A man with an unhurried, careful voice spent an hour describing the great houses of America, the Vanderbilt properties, the Astor houses, the Newport season at its height. He described the rooms, the meals, the social rituals. He described the kitchens at one point, and his voice was neither mocking nor reverent, just steady and explanatory, the voice of someone who thinks facts are interesting on their own merits. He said that some of the Newport cottages had been built on land held under very old arrangements, colonial land grants in some cases, or leases with the city of Newport, and that some of these arrangements included restrictions on what could be constructed in the main dwelling. Cooking facilities, he said, were sometimes explicitly prohibited in the primary structure because of the fire risk they posed in buildings filled with valuable furnishings and irreplaceable art. The kitchens were therefore housed in separate buildings or in deeply buried service wings, connected to the main house by underground passages, actual underground passages, in some cases gas-lit and tiled, through which the food travelled from the place of preparation to the place of presentation. I was 7 years old and lying on the floor in front of the radio, and I felt something shift in my understanding of the world. It wasn't that I understood what it meant. Not yet. Not fully. But I felt the strangeness of it. A house so large and so important that the cooking happened underground. A house where the women who presided over the dinner table were separated from the women who made the dinner by 40 feet of subterranean corridor and the entire architecture of the house itself. And then the radio moved on to something else, and my father said something about the corn report, and my mother got up to get the lamp, and the moment passed. But I kept it. I have been keeping it and turning it over for 86 years. The library was the other world I found in those years. The county library was in the county seat, which was 10 miles away, and we didn't go often. It was a trip, not a habit in those days before people drove everywhere for everything. But my mother took me perhaps once a month, in the summer especially, and I came home with an armful of books each time and read them steadily through the following weeks. I was a fast reader, which my teacher considered both a gift and a mild problem. I read what I was supposed to read and then kept going, into the adult sections, into the history shelves, into the geography books with their photographs of places that seemed as remote from Millhaven, Ohio as the moon. I found a book about American society in the Gilded Age, a history book, not a magazine article, with dense text and only a few illustrations. I was perhaps 9 when I read it, which was probably too young for it, but I read it anyway, and some of what it said stayed with me even when the specifics blurred. There were people in America, it seemed, who lived in a world so far removed from the one I knew that to call us fellow citizens seemed almost a courtesy. They did not cook. They did not clean. They did not worry about the price of flour or the coal supply or the weather as it affected the crops. They worried about social position, about whether they were invited to the right things, about the correct management of impressions. I didn't feel angry about this, reading it at 9. I felt curious. I felt the way you feel looking at a photograph of a place you've never been. Not envious, exactly, but trying to understand. Trying to imagine being in that photograph. Trying to figure out what it would mean. What it would mean to have a kitchen that wasn't allowed to exist in your house. To live on food that came from underground. If you're finding some comfort here, some company on this night, I'm glad. I'll be here each week with a new evening like this. Come back whenever you need someone to sit with. I didn't know then what I know now, but I'm getting there. The library book about Gilded Age society had a chapter about Newport that I returned to many times over the following months. I was a borrower of books by habit, returning them before I'd finished and then requesting them again, which the librarian Mrs. Finch tolerated with the patience of someone who understood that some children read differently from others. She ordered books I requested sometimes, if the request was reasonable. I told her once that I was interested in the domestic arrangements of large houses, and she looked at me for a moment and then went and found me 3 books on the subject, none of which I would have known to ask for. Mrs. Finch. I want to say her name because she was the kind of person who shaped things without being remembered. She was at that library for 27 years, and during those years she put books in the hands of every child who came through the door, and some who were shy about coming through it. She knew which children needed to be pushed toward harder things, and which needed to be allowed to find their own way. She never spoke of this as a skill or a gift. She spoke of it as books, as if the books themselves were the active agents, and she was simply managing the logistics. I told her on one of those visits in the late 1930s about the Newport kitchens, about what I'd learned from the radio program, what I was trying to understand. She listened with the quality of attention that good librarians have, total, patient, without any desire to redirect or correct. "It sounds," she said when I'd finished, "like you're interested in who does the work that other people don't see." I thought about this. "I suppose I am," I said. "That's a very good thing to be interested in," she said. And she went and found me 2 more books. I carried those books home on the school bus and read them at the kitchen table while my mother was at the stove, which was where I always read. The kitchen table was the reading table by default. There was more light there than anywhere else in the house, and the warmth of the stove made it comfortable in winter, and my mother's presence was comfortable in itself. The background sound of her work something I could tune out the way you tune out a familiar sound, until it becomes a kind of silence. My mother knew I was interested in Newport. She was interested herself, in a different way, a practical way, the way she was interested in anything that involved the management of a household at scale. She asked me once what the servants' wages had been in those houses, and I went back to the library and found out and told her, and she thought about it for a moment and then said that seemed about right for that kind of work in that kind of place, which I understood to mean she'd done the calculation against what she knew labour was worth and found it neither surprising nor adequate. She was always doing that calculation in the background, the value of work, the cost of things, the arithmetic of a household, which she understood as a complete system, inputs and outputs, the pantry and the root cellar and the garden as supply lines, the table as the point of delivery. My mother would have been excellent at managing a Newport household, but she would have wanted to know where the kitchen was. "If you're finding some comfort here, some company on this night, I'm glad. I'll be here each week with a new evening like this. Come back whenever you need someone to sit with." I was 10 when the war began for us, not young enough to be wholly shielded from it, not old enough to understand the full weight of what was happening. I was in the particular middle of childhood, old enough to read the newspapers my father brought home, old enough to understand that the names of places my teacher had shown me on the globe now meant something frightening, old enough to listen to the war news on the radio with a feeling in my stomach that I didn't have a word for yet. My brother Tommy was 16 when Pearl Harbor happened. By 1943 he was in the army, and our house contracted around his absence the way a lung contracts around a wound. My mother dealt with Tommy's absence by cooking, or perhaps she always cooked that much. Perhaps it was only that I was older now and noticed the industry of it more clearly. But in those years, from 1943 to 1945, I was aware of the kitchen with a new intensity, of my mother in it, of what it was for. The ration books. I think about the ration books often. They were small booklets slightly larger than a wallet, with rows of stamps in different colours. Red stamps for meat and fats, blue stamps for processed foods, coupons for sugar and coffee and shoes. You surrendered a stamp when you bought certain things, and when the stamps were gone, they were gone. The ration book sat on the kitchen shelf beside the flour tin, and my mother consulted it the way a general consults a map, studying the available stamps, planning the week's meals, making calculations. Sugar was the hardest. My mother had a sweet tooth that she rarely indulged even before rationing, but during the war years the sugar tin became a thing you could not touch without permission. We had perhaps 12 ounces a week, which sounds like more than it is when you're baking for 3 people. She stretched it, honey when she had it, molasses when she didn't, and a kind of oatmeal cookie with very little sugar that we ate on Sunday afternoons as if they were a luxury. Coffee was the other hardship. Not rationed in the beginning, but expensive, and my father had taken to drinking it so diluted by the middle of the war that it was really more warm brown water than coffee. My mother still made hers strong and gave him the weaker half without comment. I didn't understand this until years later. The small daily kindnesses that go unremarked and are never repaid because they are simply part of the grammar of a marriage. Meat was easier for us than for families in town. We had chickens and my father kept pigs, and in September there was always a hog killing, a cold, smoky autumn smell I associate with those years, the fat rendering in the big outdoor pot, the hams hung in the smokehouse. The farm fed us in ways that town families couldn't feed themselves. We had enough generally, more than enough of some things. What we had less of was peace. Not that it was stated. My parents didn't talk about the fear in front of me. The war was discussed matter-of-factly at the supper table, what the radio had said that evening, where the fighting was, what the headlines suggested. My father had opinions about the progress of things and stated them briefly and without elaboration. My mother listened and said little, but I began to understand that year how silence can hold fear, how you can be very quiet about something precisely because speaking it would make it too real. Tommy's letters came every 2 or 3 weeks, then sometimes every month. They were cheerful in the way that military letters are required to be cheerful. He couldn't say where he was, couldn't describe the fighting, couldn't give us any real picture of his days. He asked about the farm, he asked what we'd had for Sunday dinner, he asked about the neighbours and the weather, and whether my father had fixed the fence on the north pasture. Reading those letters, I read them many times, each one long after they arrived. I understood that he was building the kitchen in his mind, our kitchen, our table, our Sunday dinner, holding it as a way of surviving wherever he was. My mother wrote back every week without fail. The ordinary things, every week, the ordinary things. What the weather was doing, how the crops were coming, what we'd had for supper. She didn't understand it entirely, why those details mattered, but she sent them because he'd asked for them, and years later Tommy told me that those letters were what kept him most clearly oriented to the fact of home. The smell of bread, she'd write. I made the potato soup you always liked. The kitchen smells like onions, and the good kind of cold is coming in. A kitchen held in a letter sent across an ocean to a soldier who needed to remember what ordinary life felt like. I was old enough by the middle of the war to help in the kitchen in a meaningful way, not just the tasks I'd been doing since I was small, setting the table, drying dishes, fetching things from the pantry, but real cooking, the kind where you were responsible for the outcome. My mother began teaching me in earnest when I was 12, 13. She stood beside me and watched while I made biscuits, and her watching was not interfering. She waited to see if I needed help before she said anything, which I understand now was a particular kind of teaching, the kind that trusts the student to find her own way. I made the biscuits wrong for a month. Too much flour, not enough fat, or I'd overworked the dough and they'd come out tough. My mother ate the wrong biscuits without comment. That was the lesson. You made them wrong, and you ate what you'd made, and you tried again. There was no waste and no shame in it. The wrong biscuits still fed us. The Victory Garden was mine to tend in the last summer, 1945. My mother gave it over to me when her back began to trouble her in the spring, and I took it on with the particular seriousness of a 15-year-old girl who has been trusted with something real. The garden at its summer height was a kind of education, in patience, in what different plants wanted, in the satisfaction of harvesting something you'd put in the ground months before. I planted too much of some things and not enough of others, and the zucchini got away from me in August the way it always does if you're not paying attention. My mother accepted the oversized zucchini without criticism and made it into bread and soup and a kind of relish we ate for the rest of the year. There were other women in the neighbourhood doing the same things, managing their households, feeding their families, running their victory gardens, collecting scrap metal for the drives that came through every few months. Mrs. Hendricks, 2 roads over, had 3 sons overseas and ran her farm by herself, and still managed to send a plate of cookies to every family within 2 miles whenever something difficult happened. Mrs. Kowalski, who had come from Poland as a young woman and whose husband had died before the war, made bread every week that I still think was the best bread I ever tasted. She used a sourdough starter that she said was 40 years old, that she'd brought with her from Krakow, maintained through 2 ocean crossings and 40 years in Ohio. The bread tasted like all of that somehow. These were the women I grew up among, women who cooked 3 meals a day and managed whatever the war required of them and didn't stop. Their kitchens were visible and present and working without pause, and they, the women, were visible too. No underground passages, no invisible labour, just women at their stoves every day. The war ended in the autumn of 1945, and Tommy came home and the house expanded back around him slowly. But the war years had changed something in the kitchen, or perhaps they'd shown me something that was always there. They had shown me that the kitchen was not incidental. It was where the fear was managed and the hope was kept, and the connection to the people who were far away was maintained. My mother wrote Tommy about the kitchen every week. He asked about the kitchen in every letter. The kitchen was the shorthand for everything else, for safety, for home, for the fact of being alive and ordinary and fed. Somewhere in the back of my mind, even then, I was keeping the image of those Newport kitchens, the hidden passages, the food that appeared from nowhere, and the contrast with my mother at the Monarch stove every day, her hands always doing something, the ration book on the shelf, the letters to Tommy about the soup. Some things you only understand looking back. This was one of them. I want to tell you more about those ration years, because memory works the way it does. The extraordinary things fade faster than the ordinary ones. I remember the ration books clearly, but what I remember most clearly is the texture of the daily work, the way my mother moved around a smaller pantry without complaint, the way the meals adapted themselves, week by week, to whatever the stamps allowed. We ate beans more than we had before, white navy beans, pinto beans, the dried black-eyed peas my father had started growing as a cover crop, and which my mother turned into a dish with pork fat and herbs that was nothing like the Newport dining room and everything like what food is actually for. We ate egg dishes when the hens laid well. We ate what the garden gave, which in late summer was generous and in February was nothing at all, and we ate what the root cellar had put by in the months between those extremes. I learned to cook beets that winter, not by choice. The beets had done well in the garden and we had them in abundance, and beets are the kind of vegetable that demands to be cooked rather than eaten raw when you have them in quantity. My mother taught me to roast them, which I hadn't known was possible, having only seen them boiled. The roasted beet is an entirely different vegetable from the boiled one, sweeter, denser, its earthiness concentrated in a way that I found deeply satisfying. I've eaten beets my entire life since and never grown tired of them. Mrs. Kowalski. I keep coming back to Mrs. Kowalski. She lived in the house at the end of the road, a walk of perhaps 10 minutes from ours, a widow who had been a widow for so long that I never knew she'd been anything else until I was old enough to ask. She was short and broad and moved with a purposeful precision that I later associated with people who have always had a great deal to do and no time to waste in doing it. Her bread was famous in the neighbourhood in the way that things become famous in small places, through word of mouth, through the experience of eating it once and measuring everything else against it thereafter. She used a sourdough starter that she said was 40 years old, fed every day for 4 decades, and that she credited with more personality than most people she'd met. It knows when the weather is changing, she told my mother once. Before the storm it rises too fast. You have to know it. I didn't understand this at the time. Now I do. There is a kind of knowledge that comes only from sustained attention, from doing the same thing every day for years and years until you can read it the way you read a face. My mother had it with her stove. Mrs. Kowalski had it with her starter. It is the knowledge that cannot be written down because it is held in the hands, in the nose, in the quality of attention that comes from practice. During the war years, Mrs. Kowalski baked every Thursday and brought 2 loaves to families in the neighbourhood that she had identified as having someone away. She brought us bread every Thursday for 2 years, walking 10 minutes in whatever weather there was, carrying the loaves in a cloth-covered basket. She never mentioned it as generosity. She mentioned it as bread. I have thought about this often, in the years since, about what it means to give something without making a ceremony of giving it, about the particular grace of practical kindness, the kindness that does not want to be witnessed, that just does the thing and moves on. Mrs. Kowalski had that grace. My mother had it too. The women of that road in those years had it in abundance. The Newport hostesses were generous too, by the accounts I have read. They gave to charity, entertained elaborately, supported cultural institutions. But their generosity was performed generosity, visible generosity, the kind that was recorded in the society pages and attributed to specific names. Mrs. Kowalski's bread did not appear in any newspaper. She just made it and brought it, every Thursday, in the rain and the cold, because Tommy Morrison was in the army and his mother was doing all right but could use bread. I don't set these things against each other to make anyone seem villainous. The Newport women were people of their time and world, shaped by what they had been given. But the contrast stayed with me. The bread that appeared at Mrs. Astor's table from underground, from invisible hands, and Mrs. Kowalski's bread carried 10 minutes in a cloth-covered basket set on the kitchen table by a woman who would not have recognised her own name in a newspaper. There was something else the war years taught me that I did not learn in the kitchen exactly, but that I learned because of the kitchen. I learned that food is a form of continuity. This sounds obvious now, but I do not think it is. Not really. You have to live through something difficult to understand it fully. When Tommy wrote his letters asking about Sunday dinner, he was not asking about food. He was asking about the fact that Sunday dinner was still happening, that the kitchen was still there, that my mother was still at the stove, that the particular texture of ordinary life was continuing in his absence. Food is evidence that the world is still the world, that home is still there, that when you come back there will be a kitchen to come back to. My mother understood this without articulating it. She wrote about the kitchen every week because she understood that the kitchen was the proof, not just of food, but of everything the food meant. That understanding would take the rest of my life to complete, but it started there, in those war years, with the ration books on the shelf and the beans on the stove, and Mrs. Kowalski's bread appearing on the table every Thursday like a small, certain act of faith. Tommy came home in the autumn of 1945, a Sunday afternoon in October, thin and quiet and needing some weeks before he was recognisably himself again. I remember that afternoon exactly, my mother standing on the porch and Tommy coming up the gravel drive and the particular stillness of the moment, the way the air seemed to hold before they reached each other. Then they were together on the porch and I was watching from the kitchen window, and the kettle was boiling because there was always something on the stove. The house expanded back around him, slowly. He was different. Of course he was different. Everyone who went and came back was different in ways they didn't talk about directly. But he ate my mother's food with a gratitude that was almost painful to witness, and he was back at the kitchen table within a few days, sitting the way he always had, making coffee, arguing with my father about the fence on the north pasture. The ordinary life reconstituted itself around him, and the kitchen was where it happened. It always is. I was 14 by then, and it was around that time that I started to really notice boys, though there were limited options in a place like Millhaven. The high school was in the county seat, which meant a bus ride and a world slightly larger than the one I'd grown up in. I met Frank Morrison when I was 16, at a school dance that I almost didn't go to because my best friend Loretta had a cold and I didn't want to go alone. Frank was 2 years ahead of me, the son of a man who ran a grain elevator in a town about 15 miles from ours. He was not handsome in an obvious way, but he had a quality I can only describe as still. He was a still person, not quiet exactly because he could talk plenty when he wanted to, but he moved through the world without the nervous energy that a lot of young men had. He danced well enough, which in those days was a reasonable indicator of character. He drove me home from the dance in his father's truck, which was a 1941 Ford that smelled of grain dust and a little bit of oil, and we talked the whole way about. I don't even remember the specific topics. I remember the quality of the conversation, the way it moved without effort, one thing leading to another without either of us reaching for the next thing. That's rare at 16. It was rare for me at any age, if I'm honest. We courted for 2 years, which in those days meant that Frank came to the house on Sunday afternoons and sat in the front room with my parents nearby, and we went to things together, dances, the county fair, church suppers where both our families were present. We wrote letters when we couldn't see each other, which seems quaint now but was simply how you maintained a connection over 15 miles of Ohio countryside in 1948. His letters were better than I expected. He was funnier on paper than in person, which I found endearing, as if the letters gave him a little more room. We married in June of 1952 when I was 20 years old and he was 22. The war had been over for 7 years. The world was different. There was money again, or the sensation of money, the post-war boom that my parents spoke of with a cautious wonder, as if they didn't quite trust it. New houses going up everywhere, appliances, the television set that Loretta's family got in 1951, which seemed at first like magic and after a while like furniture. Our wedding was small by choice and necessity both, a ceremony at the Methodist church my family had attended for 3 generations, perhaps 20 people, a reception at my parents' house with my mother's food. She'd been cooking for 2 days, the ham and the potato salad and the green beans from the garden and the wedding cake, which she'd made from a recipe she'd been keeping for years, a white cake with boiled frosting that she'd made twice before for practice and declared acceptable only on the 3rd try. I've thought often about that wedding cake. It was perfect, really perfect, not just by the modest standards of what we could afford, but by any standard. The frosting had that particular glossy brightness of good boiled frosting, and the cake inside was tender and not too sweet, and my mother had decorated it with small flowers from the garden, sweet peas which were still blooming in June if the weather held. It was the most beautiful thing on the table. It had come from my mother's kitchen, from her hands, from 48 years of knowing exactly how to do this thing. No caterer, no outside chef. My mother at her kitchen, making the food for her daughter's wedding. I think about that now when I see the elaborate catering arrangements at weddings, the trucks in the parking lot and the uniformed staff and the food that appears from nowhere, from a professional kitchen somewhere else, carried in and presented as if it had simply arrived. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's a different thing. Our first kitchen was in a rented house on the edge of town. Frank was working at his father's grain elevator by then, and we had enough to rent a place. A small clapboard house with 3 rooms downstairs and 2 up, and a kitchen that my mother, when she came to visit, surveyed with an expression that told me she was calculating how to help without seeming to help. The kitchen had a gas stove. I'd grown up with wood, and the transition to gas was strange and a little disorienting, that blue flame appearing at the turn of a knob, no warmth from the stove itself until a pot was on it. I kept reaching for the cast iron presence of a wood stove that wasn't there, but the gas stove was faster, more reliable, easier to control, and within a year I'd learned to cook on it, as if I'd never known anything else. I cooked differently than my mother, not worse, just differently. I was a child of the war years and the ration years, and those years had given me a particular relationship with economy that my cooking reflected. But I was also a young married woman in the early 1950s, in a post-war world producing an enormous number of new things to cook with. Canned soups, boxed cake mixes, frozen foods, the new products that filled the grocery store shelves in those years. I tried them all with the experimental hopefulness of someone who believes that easier might also be better. It wasn't, usually. The frozen peas were never quite right. The canned soup was convenient but had a particular flatness, a sodium sameness that I noticed even when I couldn't name it. The cake mixes produced a cake that looked exactly like a cake, but tasted like something that had decided to be a cake at the last minute. I still use them, sometimes. Convenience is a real thing, and when you're working and keeping a house and eventually raising children, the 10 minutes a cake mix saves you is 10 real minutes. But I never stopped making things from scratch when I had the time and the ingredients. Frank liked simple food. He liked what he'd grown up with. Pot roasts, mashed potatoes, beans cooked low and slow, soup. He was not a complicated man culinarily. He never criticised, which was the main thing. He ate what was put in front of him and said thank you, and sometimes, on a night when I'd made something that turned out particularly well, he'd look up from his plate with a small private smile that was the most eloquent compliment I've ever received. I think about love differently now than I did then. When you're young, you imagine love as something that happens at peaks, in the grand moments, the important declarations, the visible gestures. You don't understand yet that it lives mostly in the steady, ordinary repetitions, in the nightly meal, the kitchen warm, a man looking up from his soup with that particular private look, in staying through everything, in the accumulation of small, unremarkable kindnesses over a long span of years. It was around this time that I began reading more systematically about the Gilded Age, in the hours after Frank left for work and before the children came along. I found a book about Newport that gave me the full picture, or more of it than I'd had before. Not just the houses, but the social world, the hostesses and their rivalries and the elaborate rituals of the summer season. I read about Caroline Astor, who was simply Mrs. Astor to everyone who knew anything, who had defined for 2 decades exactly who counted in American society, and I read about the kitchens. The more carefully I read, the more I understood the specifics. The Newport cottages were not simply large houses with large kitchens attached. They were organised around a fundamental separation between the world of the family and the world of service, which was invisible, underground, connected to the family's world only by corridors and dumbwaiters and discreet back stairs. The family and their guests were never supposed to encounter evidence that their food had an origin. It appeared. That was all. It appeared because invisible people had made it appear. I closed the book one evening and looked around my own kitchen. The small gas stove, Frank at the table, the smell of the pot roast I was making, slow and savoury, filling the house with its particular presence. My kitchen, my hands in it, nothing hidden, nothing supposed to be invisible. What came next was slower, the way good things usually are. The thing I didn't understand about marriage when I entered it, at 20 years old in a white dress in a Methodist church in Ohio, was that it is a form of daily accumulation. It is not the moments that make it, not the wedding, not the anniversaries, not the significant events. It is the mornings, the particular way a person makes coffee, the dishes they like and the ones they don't, the exact way a specific silence between 2 people can mean comfort or tension, and learning, over years, which one you are in. Frank was a coffee person in the morning, which meant nothing to be said until the first cup was down. I am a talker in the morning, which was a source of negotiation in the first years and a settled arrangement by the second decade. He read the newspaper through breakfast. I did not. He stacked things. I dispersed them. He put the salt on everything. I did not. These are the domestic facts of a shared life, too small to report and too constant to ignore, the furniture of the days. What Frank did in the kitchen was sit at the table. That was essentially the whole of it. He sat at the table and ate what I made and said thank you, and sometimes washed the dishes, and that was a complete division of labour for 37 years, and I want to be honest about whether that seems fair to me now. It does not exactly by the standards of the world I live in now, but it was the standard of the world we both inhabited then, and Frank was not unusual in it. He was entirely representative, and the cooking was mine, genuinely mine, in a way that meant I was not resentful of it. I was territorial about it, if anything. I remember Caro, at 19, announcing that she and her roommate shared all the cooking equally, and that her roommate was an excellent cook, better than Caro herself. I remember the small, complicated feeling this gave me. Pride in Caro for having a different arrangement, for living in a world where the arrangement was different. And something else, something more possessive. My kitchen, my domain. The one room in any house we'd ever lived in, where I knew exactly where everything was and exactly what I was doing. Frank understood this, I think, without articulating it. He understood that the kitchen was mine in a way the rest of the house wasn't. Wasn't anybody's in particular, was shared space. When he did cook, on the rare occasions when I was ill or away, he moved through the kitchen with a careful deference, as if visiting a country whose customs he respected but didn't fully understand. He asked where things were. He washed everything he used before I got home, not to erase his presence, but to restore the kitchen to my order. The Newport hostesses had no kitchen to be territorial about. Their authority ended at the door to the service passage. The rooms they commanded were the drawing room and the dining room and the bedroom and the grounds. The social spaces, the performance spaces. The working space was not theirs. I wonder sometimes if they felt the absence. I wonder if there was ever a Newport hostess who stood in her magnificent drawing room and had the faintest sense of something missing. Probably not. You cannot miss what you've never had, and they had never had a kitchen. It simply wasn't part of their map of the world. Ours was. The kitchen was on every map I ever drew of a house. The the first room I identified when we visited somewhere new, the room where I always ended up at a party when I could manage it, where the food was being prepared, where I could see the actual work of the evening, where it was real. I have stood in beautiful rooms and thought them very beautiful and thought almost nothing else. I have stood in other people's kitchens and felt immediately comfortable, immediately oriented, as if I'd found the center of a compass. The kitchen in the rented house in 1952. The kitchen on Maple Street that smelled in autumn like whatever was on the stove and the particular coolness of the air that came through the back door. The kitchen I have now, small and mine and entirely adequate for what it needs to do. Frank ate my food for 37 years and always said thank you. That's not nothing. That's quite a lot. When you add it up over 37 years, the daily courtesy of noticing that someone has done something for you, the daily acknowledgement that the work is real. The Newport hostesses were acknowledged for the food that other people produced. The women who produced it were not acknowledged at all. I know which life I'd rather have had, and it is not the one with the marble dining room and the food from underground. Our first child was born in 1954, a daughter we called Ruth after my mother's mother. Then in 1956, a boy, James. Then in 1959, another daughter, Caroline, who we called Caro from the first week and never called anything else. 3 children in 5 years, which was not unusual for the time and which I now understand was a particular kind of life, full and demanding and exhausting in ways I was too busy to recognize while I was inside it. We'd moved by then, bought a house on Maple Street, the third house from the corner, a white house with green shutters and a maple tree in the front yard that dropped its leaves all at once in October, seemingly overnight, so that you'd look out the bedroom window one morning and the tree would be full and gold, and then you'd look again the next day and it would be bare, the leaves in a deep golden bank around the roots. Every year that happened, and every year I felt the same small shock of it. The kitchen in that house was a real kitchen, in a way that the rented house's kitchen had not quite been. It was larger, for one thing. There were proper cabinets, a good-sized window over the sink that looked out on the backyard where the children played. The linoleum, yellow this time with a small white pattern, was new when we moved in and stayed in good condition for years. There was a breakfast nook, a built-in bench and table in the corner where the children ate most of their meals when they were small. I've never loved a room the way I loved that kitchen. I want you to understand what I mean by that. Not that it was beautiful. It wasn't, particularly. Not that it was equipped with anything unusual. It was a standard 1950s kitchen in a standard house in a middle-sized Ohio town. What made it the room I loved was what happened in it every day, the texture of those ordinary years. Ruth at the counter, 4 years old, helping me roll out pie crust, pressing her small fingers into the dough and leaving prints. James eating cereal with total concentration, a whole-body activity for a 2-year-old. Caro, later, the baby, in her high chair in the corner, watching the kitchen with wide eyes the way babies watch everything, as if the entire world is endlessly new and worthy of careful attention. Frank came home at 5:30 most evenings, and supper was ready at 6, and those 30 minutes between his arrival and the meal were, in retrospect, among the best portions of my days. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tell me about his day, and I'd be at the stove finishing whatever needed finishing, and the children would be underfoot or at the table drawing, or once they were a little older, doing their homework. There was a particular quality of light in that kitchen in late afternoon in autumn, the sun coming through the window at a low angle, hitting the yellow linoleum and bouncing up, so the whole room was lit in this warm, diffuse way that I can see exactly if I close my eyes. I am doing it now. Closing my eyes and seeing it, the yellow light, Frank's coffee cup, Ruth's dark head bent over her colouring, the sound of something on the stove. I can be there in an instant, if I want to. That's one of the gifts of being 92. You have so many places to go back to. The smells of that kitchen. The smell of tomato soup from a can. A smell I know is banal, but which I associate with small, sick children on cold afternoons, with the particular tenderness of that. The pulling out of the soup pot for a child who couldn't go to school, the smell of a pot roast which was Sunday, the smell of chocolate cake baking, which was always for someone's birthday and which worked on the children the way the smell of bread had worked on me. You could feel the happiness in the house coming through the walls. Caro's 6th birthday cake. I should tell you about Caro's 6th birthday cake, because it was one of those particular kitchen achievements that stays with you. She wanted a pink cake. Very specifically pink, not pale pink. Not the pink that resulted from a few drops of red dye in white batter, but genuinely, deeply pink, the colour of the plastic flamingos that some of our neighbours had put in their yards that summer, which were a point of aesthetic controversy on Maple Street. I worked on it for 2 days. A white cake with a great deal of red food colouring in the batter, and a frosting I tinted separately, pink enough to satisfy even Caro. It was pink. It was magnificently pink. Caro stood in front of it with her eyes very wide, and then she looked at me and she said, "It's perfect." She was 6 years old, and she already knew the word she wanted. Those were the years when the kitchen was its most literal self, a place where food was made, but also where everything else was made. Conversations, disputes, the negotiation of who got which chair, the particular family culture that accumulates over years of daily meals. The kitchen is where families become themselves, I think, not in the dramatic moments, not in the anniversaries and the holidays, which are their own thing, but in the ordinary evenings, the Tuesday dinners, the Thursday mornings before school, the quiet Saturday lunches when nobody wanted to be anywhere else in particular. I was reading still in those years, not as much as I'd read before, not by a long stretch. 3 children under 7 leaves very little time for anything that isn't directly related to keeping them alive and moderately educated. But I found time here and there, 20 minutes in the morning before the household woke, half an hour at the breakfast nook after the children were in bed. It was at one of those late evening reading sessions that I read most carefully for the first time about the legal and architectural arrangements that governed Newport's service areas. A history book I'd borrowed, comprehensive and carefully researched, included a chapter on the domestic arrangements of the Gilded Age establishment. It described in some detail the specific lease provisions that applied to certain Newport properties. The land under several of the grandest Newport cottages was held under colonial-era grants or agreements with the city of Newport, and some of these agreements included provisions about construction in the main dwelling. In some cases, the prohibition on permanent cooking facilities in the primary structure had originated in practical fire safety considerations. Cooking fires were the leading cause of catastrophic house fires in the 19th century, and in a densely built summer colony where the houses were filled with irreplaceable art and furnishings, the risk was considered unacceptable. In other cases, the separation of kitchen from main house was a matter of aesthetic choice and social practice elevated to rule. The kitchens were not simply hidden, they were formally excluded. The food in these arrangements was prepared in separate structures on the property, transported to the main house by way of covered walkways or underground passages, and arrived at the table having travelled 40, 60, 100 feet from the place of its origin. The family and their guests ate in complete ignorance, by design, by architectural intention, of the labour that had produced what was on their plates. I sat at the breakfast nook with this book and thought about what that meant, not just socially or morally, though I thought about those things too, but practically. What did it mean to be a woman who presided over a household and never entered its kitchen, who received food at her table and did not know who had cooked it or how or where, whose authority over her own establishment extended to every room except the one where the most essential work happened? The children were asleep upstairs. Frank was asleep. The house was quiet in the particular way a house with children in it is quiet at night. A careful quiet, aware of itself, capable of being broken at any moment by a child calling from the dark. I closed the book. I looked around my kitchen. This kitchen, visible, present, smelling faintly of the dinner dishes I'd washed 2 hours ago. The centre of the house, mine. If you're still with me, I'm glad. Let yourself drift if you need to. I'll be here, and this story will wait for you. Come back when you're ready, or let it carry you to sleep. Either way is fine by me. The years after that were different, softer in some ways. I've been trying to explain the feeling of those years, and I'm not sure I have the right words for it. The word people use is busy. It was a busy time, but busy is too thin a word. It suggests only the volume of activity, when what I mean is the quality of it. The way each day was its own complete thing, full and closed, and you went to bed at the end of it tired in a way that was not unpleasant. The productive exhaustion of days that have been used. James, when he was 4, used to follow me around the kitchen, insisting on helping with whatever I was doing. He was not always helpful. Small children rarely are in a kitchen, but he had a focused intensity about it that I didn't want to discourage. I gave him tasks scaled to what he could actually accomplish. Tearing lettuce leaves, stirring things that didn't need precise stirring, washing the vegetables in a bowl of water on a low stool. He did these things with the gravity of someone performing a real function, which of course he was. When he was 5, he mixed his first batch of biscuit dough. The results were, well, my mother would have eaten them without comment, and I did too. They were small and dense and oddly shaped, and James was very proud of them. I fried them in a little butter, which helps almost any biscuit situation, and they tasted fine. James ate 4 of them and told me they were the best biscuits he had ever had, which was, at 5 years old, his honest assessment. Caro was different in the kitchen from the beginning. Where James was interested in the process, Caro was interested in the result, in what the food would look like when it was done, in whether the table was set correctly, in the aesthetic dimension of it all. She arranged the dishes on her plate before eating them in a way that I recognized, without surprise, as something my mother's mother had done. These things run in lines I can't trace, down through the generations. Frank built the girls a doll's house the Christmas that Ruth was 7 and Caro was 3. It had tiny furniture he'd made himself in the garage on autumn evenings, and Ruth and Caro played with it for years with a sustained concentration I found remarkable. The kitchen of the doll's house had a small stove, a piece of tin painted red, and tiny wooden pots and pans. I noticed that the kitchen was the room they always set up first before any other room in the house. The bedroom could wait. The parlor could wait. The kitchen had to be established. I didn't read as much as I wanted to in those years, which is the one thing I would have changed. I was reading for 20 minutes at the breakfast nook at 10 o'clock at night, which is not the ideal condition for absorbing a serious book, and many evenings I fell asleep with the book open on the table and woke to find Frank standing over me saying it was time to go upstairs. But I kept at it. The Newport books, the history of the Gilded Age, the biographies of the women who'd presided over those summers. I read about Mamie Fish, Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, formerly, whose wit was famous and whose dinner parties had an irreverence that Newport found alarming. She invented the short dinner, refusing to keep her guests at the table for 4 hours in the European fashion and insisting on an hour and a half instead. Newport society considered this subversive. I considered it practical. An hour and a half at the table is enough time. 4 hours is a performance. Mrs. Fish's chef produced the same shortened dinners that her more traditional competitors produced full-length ones, but in compressed time. Which means, I realized reading about it, that the kitchen's work was not shortened, only the guest's experience of its results was shortened. The kitchen still operated for hours before and after that hour and a half. The labor was unchanged. The visibility of it was, as always, non-existent. I thought about this at my kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, the house quiet around me, the children asleep, my kitchen at the center, the light on, the evidence visible, the smell of whatever we'd had for dinner still faintly present in the room. Nothing underground, nothing invisible, just a kitchen doing what a kitchen does, in the middle of a life that I recognized even then as a good one. If you're still with me, I'm glad. Let yourself drift if you need to. I'll be here, and this story will wait for you. Come back when you're ready, or let it carry you to sleep. Either way is fine by me. The summer of 1962, Frank and I drove to the coast. We'd never done it before, never had quite enough money or quite enough time, and 3 children are not easy to travel with. But the children were 8 and 6 and 3, and Frank's father had given us a week's use of a cabin he knew of in Connecticut, and we'd decided to stop on the way at Newport. It was Frank's idea. I'd talked about Newport enough over the years that he'd developed a mild curiosity about it. "You've been reading about it since I've known you," he said one evening in the spring, planning the route. "Let's go see it." Newport in 1962 was not Newport in 1900. The great Gilded Age had been over for 40 years. The families who'd built the cottages were diminished, in some cases extinct, their fortunes divided or dissipated over the generations. Several of the cottages had been sold to organizations, to schools and religious orders, to the city. Others still belonged to families who maintained them with a fraction of the original staff, used for a few weeks each summer by people who could no longer quite afford them, but couldn't bring themselves to let them go. We drove along Bellevue Avenue. The children were quiet in the back seat, sensing that we were somewhere that required a different kind of attention. Even Caro, who was not quite 3 and who was normally in constant motion, sat still and looked out the window. The houses were as large as I'd imagined. Larger, really, because photographs don't give you the sense of scale, the way they sit back from the road, set in grounds that even in 1962, even diminished, were immaculate. The way the stone and marble catch the light off the ocean, the way a house like the Breakers seems less like a building than like a fact. We stopped the car outside the Breakers for a while. Frank and I sat in the front looking, and the children looked too, without asking questions for once in their lives. "How many people lived here?" Ruth asked eventually. "In the summer when the family came," I said, "about a dozen family members, and then maybe 50 or 60 people to take care of them." 60 people, she said, just to take care of 12 people? Something like that. She looked at the house a while longer. "That seems like a lot," she said. We drove along the cliff walk later that afternoon, getting out and walking for a while, the ocean grey and rough below us, the backs of the cottages rising on our left. From the cliff walk, you could see the service areas, the lower doors, the basement windows, the passages where deliveries were made, where coal was brought in, where the food arrived that would eventually appear at those long tables in those vast dining rooms, the working parts, the parts that were supposed to be invisible from the front. "The food came in down there," I told Frank, pointing to a basement-level passage behind one of the larger houses. "And where was the kitchen?" "Underground, or separate, connected by a long passage. The families weren't supposed to be aware of where it happened." Frank looked at the passage for a moment. "That must have been strange," he said. "I think it was normal to them," I said. "I think they'd never known anything different." We walked for a while without talking, the children running ahead on the path, the ocean doing what oceans do. There is a particular quality of Atlantic air in late summer that I've never found anywhere else. It's cool even on warm days, and it carries salt and something else, something mineral and very old, the smell of an ocean that has been there for so long it has opinions about things. I breathed it in and thought about what it must have smelled like in 1900 on this same cliff walk, and the women in their long dresses and elaborate hats walking along it with their chaperones while down below, in the kitchens that were not supposed to exist, other women stirred the soup. I've read a great deal more about Newport in the years since that visit. By the late 1960s and through the 1970s, the Preservation Society of Newport County was opening the cottages for formal tours, and the scholarship about that world was growing. I read the books as they came out over the years, the specific arrangements, the professional staffing, the social machinery. At the Breakers, the kitchen was in a service wing connected to the main house by a long corridor. The food travelled on wheeled carts, pushed by footmen trained to do it silently. The dining room had a dumbwaiter for family meals in informal rooms. The kitchen itself was enormous, a professional operation staffed by a chef and his brigade, equipped with a coal range of considerable size, copper pots of every dimension hanging from ceiling hooks. A kitchen that any restaurant chef of the 1890s would have recognized immediately as serious. Marble House, built for Alva Smith Vanderbilt in 1892, had its kitchen in a separate building to the rear, connected by a covered walkway. Alva Vanderbilt, later Alva Belmont, was one of the most formidable women of the Newport social world, brilliant and ruthless and possessed of enormous energy. She challenged social conventions when she found them inconvenient and reshaped the entire structure of American high society through the force of her will. And yet she accepted absolutely the convention that her relationship to her own kitchen should be one of complete and performative ignorance. She would not have known the name of her chef. She would not have known what he was planning to cook on any given evening until it appeared at her table. Rosecliff was built for Tessie Ulrichs, another Newport grande dame who was famous for her extravagant parties. She once held a dinner for which she imported white roses by the thousand and had them arranged throughout the rooms so that the guests arrived to a house that seemed to be made of flowers. The dinner itself was produced underground, in the usual way, by the usual invisible staff. Tessie Ulrichs was celebrated for that party for years afterward. Her chef was not celebrated at all. There was a woman named Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont by then, after her divorce and second marriage, who became in her later years a passionate suffragette. She used her Newport cottage, Belcourt Castle, as a venue for suffrage meetings, and she argued publicly and vigorously for women's right to vote, to be educated, to have careers and lives outside the domestic sphere. I've thought about her often, about the particular irony of her position. Here was a woman who spent decades fighting for other women's freedom and dignity, presiding over a household that was built on the invisible labor of women who had no freedom or dignity within that household at all. I don't say this to condemn her. People are complicated. The suffrage work was real and important, but the hidden kitchen was also real, and the women in it were also real, and she never appeared to connect the two. Ruth tugged on my sleeve as we walked that first afternoon on the cliff walk at Newport in 1962. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. She was 8 and perceptive in the way some 8-year-olds are. "Kitchens," I said. She thought about this. Our kitchen? Ours and other people's. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ocean. Then she said, "I like our kitchen." "So do I," said. "So do I." We went back to Newport in 1978, Frank and I alone, the children grown by then, out of the house or nearly. The Breakers was fully open for tours by that time, and we walked through it properly. We saw the rooms that the photographs had shown me years before. The Great Hall, the dining room, the drawing rooms, and then we found the stairs down to the service wing. The kitchen was cold and quiet. The ranges had been dark for decades. The copper pots, green now with age, still hung from the ceiling hooks. The long corridor that connected it to the main house stretched away in the half-light, tiled and dim. Frank stood in the middle of that kitchen for a long time looking at it. Then he said, "Your mother would have known what to do with every inch of this." He was right. She would have. I didn't know then what I know now, but I'm getting there. What I came to understand about Newport in those years of reading was that it represented an experiment, a conscious, deliberate attempt to construct a way of life that had no precedent in America. The Vanderbilts and the Astors and the Belmonts were not imitating some American tradition of grandeur. They were borrowing a European one, importing it wholesale, and planting it on a rocky Rhode Island headland as if it might take root. The European aristocratic model that Newport imitated was itself built on centuries of invisible labour. The English country house, which was the template for many of the Newport estates, had been perfecting the art of the hidden servant for 300 years. The below-stairs world, the kitchen, the scullery, the servants' hall, the housekeeper's room, was a complete parallel universe that operated on entirely different rules from the above-stairs world it supported. The two worlds rarely intersected, and when they did, the intersection was brief, formal, and governed by a complex protocol of deference that both parties understood. The Newport adaptation of this system was not a copy but a compression. These houses were used for 8 or 10 weeks a year, not year-round. The staff was assembled for the season and dispersed at its end. The infrastructure of service, the kitchens, the laundries, the storage rooms, had to be built and equipped and then essentially mothballed for 9 months of every 12. The expense of this was staggering by any ordinary measure, and yet it was considered not just acceptable but necessary, because without it the essential performance could not be staged. The performance. I've come to think of the Newport season as a performance, in the theatrical sense. It had a stage, the cottages, the cliff walk, the casino, the lawn tennis courts, the harbour. It had a script, the sequence of calls and dinners and balls and picnics and sailing outings that constituted the social calendar. It had costumes, the successive changes of elaborate clothing that a Newport hostess required for a single day, morning dress and afternoon dress and dinner dress and the correct jewellery for each. And it had a director for some years in the person of Mrs. Astor. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. Astor, simply, to everyone who moved in those circles. She was the presiding intelligence of American high society for the better part of 2 decades, and her authority was exercised through a combination of personal force and the practical power of her guest lists. To be on her list was to be legitimate. To be excluded was to be, in a social sense, non-existent. She kept a literal list, the list of people acceptable for her annual January ball, which seated approximately 400 people, and which, when the newspapers asked why 400, her social secretary Ward McAllister answered with the sentence that has echoed ever since: "There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society." Society, by definition, was those Mrs. Astor invited. She spent her summers at Newport, in Beechwood, her cottage on Bellevue Avenue, And Beechwood, like the other great Newport cottages, operated on the principle that food appeared from somewhere that was not the kitchen, in a kitchen that was not in the house, made by women whose names did not appear in any social column. I've wondered, in the years of thinking about this, whether Mrs. Astor ever thought about where her food came from, whether it ever occurred to her in some quiet moment that the dinners she was famous for, the dinners that defined the social hierarchy of the Gilded Age, had originated in a room she had never entered, in the hands of people she did not know, whether that seemed strange to her, or whether it was simply so unremarkable, so entirely the way things were, that it required no thought at all. I think it probably required no thought. That is perhaps the most interesting thing about privilege in that form. It doesn't require the privileged to think about it. It builds the thinking out of the architecture. The passage goes underground so that you never have to consider who cooked your dinner because the physical evidence of where your dinner came from has been removed from your sight. The women who did the cooking, meanwhile, were thinking about nothing but the work, the quality of the stock, the temperature of the oven, the timing of the courses, so that everything arrived at the table at the right moment. They were not thinking about whether their labor was seen or not. Or if they were, the thinking was of a different kind from the comfortable non-thinking happening upstairs. They were thinking about rent and wages and references and whether next season they would be engaged again. Frank stood in the Breakers' kitchen in 1978 and said your mother would have known what to do with every inch of this. He was right. But what he didn't say, what I thought after was, my mother would also have known the names of the women who worked there. She would have asked. She would have wanted to know. That was the difference finally. Not the kitchen itself, but the acknowledgement of who was in it. Newport in its golden decades was built on the active refusal of that acknowledgement. The architecture enforced the refusal. The social code enforced the refusal. The very phrase underground kitchen was a refusal. The kitchen was not underground because it was convenient to put it there, but because putting it underground made it possible to pretend daily that it wasn't there at all. And yet it was always there. The food always came from somewhere. The labor was always real, always present, always the foundation of everything that happened above it. Ruth, walking the cliff walk at 8 years old, said, "I like our kitchen." She didn't know why she was saying it, but she knew it mattered. So did I. I have always known it mattered. It just took me most of a lifetime to understand completely why. The 1960s passed through our house the way weather passes through a landscape, affecting it, shaping it in ways you only see later, but not destroying it. We were not people to whom dramatic things tended to happen. We were steady people, Frank and I, people of habit and work and the long rhythms of domestic life. Frank was managing the grain elevator by then, his father having retired. The children were in school, all three of them, and the house, which had been so full of noise and need when they were small, began to take on a different quality. Not quieter exactly, Ruth and James argued constantly, with the focused dedication of siblings who know each other's every weakness, but different. The kitchen became a different room when the children could feed themselves, when they were in and out on their own schedules, when I wasn't always stationed at the stove. I worked part-time from 1963 to 1970 at the county library. 4 afternoons a week, which suited me well. I'd spent 20 years borrowing books from that library, and spending time among them felt like coming home to a place I'd been visiting all my life. The work was quiet and orderly and required a kind of attention I found genuinely restful, the attention of someone who is responsible for knowing where things are, which is a different kind of attention from the attention of someone responsible for knowing how things are done. I liked both kinds, as it turned out. The drive to the library took me past the house where Mrs. Perkins lived. She was 4 houses down from us on Maple Street, a widow in her 60s with grown children who had moved away, immaculately kept, always, dressed as if someone might come to call at any moment, her house visible from the street as pristine and ordered. But I noticed, over the years, that the light in her kitchen window was almost never on in the evenings. I never smelled anything cooking when I walked past. I wondered sometimes what she ate, whether she had someone else do it, whether she lived something like the Newport way, food appearing from somewhere else, the kitchen a room she didn't use. She seemed to me, without my being able to explain it fully, lonely, as if she'd organized her life around the appearance of things at the expense of the substance of them. I don't know if this is fair. I didn't know her well enough to know. It was at the library that I found the books that gave me the fullest picture of Newport. By the late 1960s, there was a small renaissance of interest in the Gilded Age, scholars and journalists writing about it. The Preservation Society of Newport County opening the cottages for tours and documenting them properly. Books were available that hadn't existed before. I read them steadily over those years, carrying one home at a time. The world of Newport in its prime, roughly 1880 to 1914 years, was stranger and more particular than I'd imagined from the outside. The families who summered there were not simply wealthy. They were wealthy in a way that had not existed before and has not quite existed since. A concentration of new American industrial money in a generation that had very few precedents for what to do with it, and turned therefore to Europe for models. They imported the furnishings from abroad, the architects from abroad, and in many cases the domestic staff from abroad, French chefs and English butlers trained in households where that kind of service had generations of precedent. Mamie Fish, Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, to use her proper name, was the Newport hostess I found most interesting in those years of reading. She had a wit that her circle found either delightful or alarming, and she was known for throwing parties that were unconventional by Newport standards, dinners that began at the unusual hour of 7:30 rather than 8, entertainments that were unexpected, evenings with an energy and unpredictability that more formal Newport establishments carefully avoided. She once invited guests to a dinner in honor of Prince del Drago of Corsica, who turned out to be a monkey in evening clothes. Even Newport thought that was a bit much. But Mamie Fish, for all her eccentricity, presided over her dinner table in the same way as every other Newport hostess, receiving the food from invisible hands, crediting the excellence of the meal to the general air of her establishment without reference to the people who had produced it. She was famous for her table. Her chef was not famous at all. The women's movement was picking up in those years, the late 1960s, the early 1970s, and I watched it from a certain distance with a complicated mixture of recognition and uncertainty. The recognition, yes, the work of keeping a house and raising children was invisible labor, uncompensated, rarely acknowledged. Yes, women had been confined to a domestic sphere that limited them in real ways. The uncertainty was harder to articulate. The kitchen, for me, was not a confinement. It was a center. I argued about this with my friend Carol, who had gone back to school in her 30s and come out with opinions she delivered with the urgency of someone newly freed from a long confinement. "You shouldn't have to cook," Carol said. "That's the whole point. You shouldn't have to." I thought about how to explain that I didn't experience it only as having to. I thought about my mother at the Monarch stove. I thought about the Newport hostesses. I thought about who was free and who wasn't. "The Newport hostesses didn't cook," I said. "They weren't allowed to. The kitchen was hidden underground and staffed by other women who were also working and also largely invisible. Getting out of the kitchen didn't help those women. It just moved the work to someone else's hands." Carol looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "But you're talking about servants." "Yes," I said, "I'm talking about servants. I'm also talking about my mother and about Mrs. Henderson," I thought, though I didn't say that. We were sitting at my kitchen table, which was where we always had our conversations, because that was where they happened, where the coffee was, where the afternoon light came through in a good way, where there was room to spread out and think. Carol looked around the kitchen as if seeing it from a new angle. "But you chose this," she said. "That's the difference. You chose the kitchen." I thought about this. I had chosen it. Yes, in the sense that I'd chosen Frank and chosen a life that organized itself around the house and the children and the kitchen, but I'd also been formed for it by my mother, by the Depression years, by the war years, by 20 years of watching my mother's hands in that kitchen in Millhaven. The choosing and the forming were not easily separated. "I don't think the Newport hostesses chose it either," I said. "They were formed for a different life, and they lived that life. And the kitchen was part of what they were formed not to know." The conversation never fully resolved. These things don't, usually, but I kept thinking about it, over the months and years that followed, about what it meant for a woman's relationship to her own kitchen to be organized by the world around her, rather than by her own choices. About the Newport solution, and why it wasn't a solution. About what freedom might actually look like. The answer I kept coming back to was visibility. The freedom I wanted, the freedom my mother had in some sense, even with all her labor, was for the work to be seen, for it to count. for the women who did it in their kitchens above ground or underground to be acknowledged as people who were doing something real and important and worthy of recognition. That hadn't happened fully. Not at Newport, not entirely even in our own lives, but at least in my kitchen it wasn't hidden. At least in my kitchen the work was visible, and I was visible, and the food came from hands that had names. There's a part of this story that still surprises me when I think about it. I want to tell you about 1969 specifically, the year the library got a new shipment of books, history, social history, the kind of careful scholarship about domestic life in America that hadn't existed 20 years earlier. A young historian had written a book about the servant class in Gilded Age America that I borrowed in October of that year and renewed twice before I finally finished it. The book documented, with exhaustive care, what the working life of a domestic servant in a Newport cottage had actually been. The hours, 14, 15 hours a day during the season. The wages, a head cook might earn between $18 and $30 per month in 1900, which was a reasonable sum by the standards of the time, though not for the scale of the work. The hierarchy. The kitchen was its own world, with its own chain of command. Chef at the top, then the first cook, the second cook, the kitchen maid, the scullery maid. Each knew her place exactly. Each stayed in it. What struck me most in that book was a section about the scullery maids. They were at the bottom of the kitchen hierarchy, responsible for the washing up, the pots and the pans and the dishes and the serving equipment, all of it to be washed by hand after every meal in water heated on the range. A Newport dinner for 20 produced a volume of washing up that I tried to calculate and gave up on. It was simply enormous, and it was done by the person at the lowest rung of the hierarchy for the lowest wages in a room adjacent to the kitchen, which was already underground. The scullery maid was, in a sense, the most invisible person in the most invisible part of a house organized around invisibility. She was at the bottom of the underground world. She was doing the work that even the other kitchen servants didn't have to do. I thought about her. This unnamed, uncredited young woman, usually an immigrant or the daughter of immigrants, washing the dishes from which Caroline Astor or Alva Vanderbilt had eaten a 10-course dinner. The conversation at that table, society gossip, the movements of certain families, whether the Vanderbilts would build again at Newport this season, the woman in the scullery, the burned pots, the cold water, the aching hands. I went home from the library with that book and sat at my kitchen table and looked at my own dishes drying in the rack by the sink. My dishes, my rack, my kitchen, my life, visible, above ground, acknowledged. The argument with Carol happened not long after I read that book, The Women's Movement and its Conversation about Domestic Labor. Carol's certainty that the kitchen was a confinement from which women needed liberation, and my complicated response to that certainty. What I kept trying to explain to Carol, and couldn't quite, was that the Newport model was not liberation. Taking women out of the kitchen and putting other women into it, hiding those women underground, denying their labor, paying them 14 hours a day for $30 a month, was not a feminist project. It was a class project. It freed upper-class women from domestic labor by intensifying the domestic labor of working-class women and then erasing their existence from the record. The actual liberation would have been acknowledgement, would have been seeing the scullery maid and saying, "You are doing something real and important and your work counts." That never happened at Newport. It barely happened anywhere in those years. My mother's kitchen was not a liberation in the formal sense. She worked hard in it and was never paid for it. But it was visible. It was hers. The work was seen, by me, by Tommy, by my father, by everyone who came into that house and smelled what was cooking and knew who had made it. I do not think my mother would have traded visibility for the kind of freedom that puts the work underground. She worked too honestly for that. Frank died in the spring of 1989 of a heart attack on a Saturday morning in April. He was in the backyard. He'd been putting in the early peas, which was a thing he did every April, as reliably as the calendar turning, and then he was on the ground, and then the ambulance came, and I was in a waiting room, and then a doctor was talking to me, and it was over. These things happen quickly, at the end. Whatever you've been imagining about how it will go, the reality is usually much quicker and much simpler and much more final. I am not going to dwell on this. You are trying to sleep, and grief is not what I want to give you tonight. But I want you to know it happened, because the kitchen after is different from the kitchen before, and to understand why, you have to know there was a before. The kitchen, after. The first week other people cooked. The children came. Ruth from Cleveland, James from Columbus, Caro from Pittsburgh, and they cooked in my kitchen, which was strange and touching to see them in it. Ruth knew her way around it better than the others, having spent more time there as she'd grown up. Caro, who had always been a capable cook herself, worked quietly and efficiently, producing meals with my pots and pans and my refrigerator's contents in a way that was both practical help and a kind of grief management, I think, for her as much as for me. James, who could not cook, washed dishes. He washed every dish that existed in the house over and over because there was nothing else he knew how to do, and he needed to be doing something with his hands. After they left, the kitchen was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not empty, I was in it, I cooked in it every day, the rhythms of it continued, but quiet. Frank had not been allowed presence in the kitchen, hadn't been in the kitchen much at all, except to sit at the table. But he had been a presence at the table, which is different from being a presence in the kitchen itself, and yet his absence was most palpable there, at mealtimes. The chair on the other side of the table, the fact of there being only one coffee cup to wash in the morning. I cooked less than I had. This is the thing no one tells you about cooking for one. It is entirely differently constituted from cooking for 2, for 3, for 5. The recipes I'd used for 30 years made 6 servings, 8 servings. I cut everything in thirds, in quarters, and still had more than I needed. I began eating the same pot of soup for several days running, the way my mother had in the Depression years, which was economical, which was sensible, which also made me feel some evenings as though I'd stepped backward through time. What I ate in that first year after Frank's death: bean soup on Monday and Tuesday, a small chicken on Wednesday, from which I made sandwiches on Thursday, and a soup on Friday from the carcass, eggs at the weekend, an omelette with whatever was in the vegetable drawer, a bowl of oatmeal every morning which Frank had never liked, and which I now ate with a freedom that was melancholy in the particular way that small freedoms can be melancholy when they come at too high a cost. Coffee, always. The coffee was the same. My mother by then was in her late 80s. She was still in the farmhouse, still making her own meals in her own kitchen, which I visited on Sundays and which had not changed much in 50 years. The Monarch stove had been replaced in the late 1960s by an electric range, which my mother regarded with the tolerance she extended to most things she hadn't chosen. The table was still there, still pine, still the center of the room. The braided rug by the stove had been replaced so many times that there was no material continuity between the original and the current one, and yet it was still the rug. The pantry shelves were less full than they'd been now that it was only her, but they were still full because my mother did not know any other way to have a pantry. I told her one afternoon when I was visiting that first autumn about what I'd been reading about Newport. The research had continued slowly over the years. More books, more articles, a trip Frank and I had made back to Newport in 1978 when the Breakers was fully open for tours and we'd walked through it properly, stood in that kitchen. The kitchen, I told her, connected to the dining room by a passage about 40 feet long. The food travelled in covered carts, so the smells wouldn't come through, so the family wouldn't hear anything. My mother looked at me for a moment, then she looked at her own kitchen and was quiet for a few seconds. "That seems like a long way to carry a plate of food," she said. I laughed. I hadn't expected to laugh in the weeks after Frank died, but there it was, my mother's practicality, as reliable as the stove. "It did seem like a long way," I agreed. She was quiet another moment. "Did it seem sad?" she asked. "When you saw it?" "The kitchen." "The whole thing, the house, living like that." I thought about it. The Breakers, on that second visit, had been magnificent and strange and a little melancholy. The enormous rooms, the painted ceilings, the scale of it all, and the persistent sense that the family had never quite inhabited it the way a house should be inhabited. They'd passed through it in the summer season and receded, and it had stood empty, waiting, 9 months of 12. It had felt, walking through it, like a stage set between performances. "Yes," I said. "A little sad. The kitchen especially. It was such a working kitchen, a real professional kitchen, enormous, well-equipped, and it had been hidden, as if it was something to be ashamed of." My mother nodded, as if she'd expected this. "Work shouldn't be hidden," she said. "Work is honest." She was right. It is. It's one of the things I've understood more clearly as I've gotten older, that the work is the thing, not the appearance, not the performance, the actual physical daily work of keeping people fed and warm and alive. The bean soup, the bread, the flour sack in the corner, that's honest. That's real. The Newport kitchens were real too, even if they were hidden, perhaps more real than anything else in those houses because they produced something that mattered. My mother died in 1993 at 89 in the farmhouse kitchen. She had been sitting in her chair at the table reading the newspaper. She read it every day, beginning to end until the very end of her life, and she simply was not there anymore when my sister-in-law came to bring her lunch. Peacefully, the doctor said, and I believe it. My mother was a practical woman. She would have considered that an efficient way to go. After her death, I sold the Maple Street house and moved to the apartment where I still live. The kitchen there is smaller, 3 rooms total. But I've been in it for 30 years now, and it knows me the way all kitchens eventually know the people who use them, the particular positions of things, the way I reach left for the wooden spoon before I've consciously decided I need it. I went back to Newport one more time in 2005 with Ruth and James and Caro, all 3 of them, an expedition, something I'd never thought I'd manage at 74. We drove up from different directions and met at Newport and spent 2 days walking through the houses. Standing in the breaker's kitchen that time, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, a kind of gratitude, not for having seen it, though that too, but for the fact that I understood it, that I could look at that kitchen with its copper pots and its enormous cold range and its long corridor running toward the main house and understand exactly what it was and what it had cost, the labor it had contained. The women whose names are not in any book who had stood at those ranges and produced those dinners, season after season, while upstairs the world went on as if none of it was happening. My mother knew. She always knew. Work is honest, she said in her kitchen at 85 with the braided rug on the floor and the electric range where the Monarch stove had been. I think of her every time I make soup, which is often, the soup pot on the stove, the smell of it in the apartment, the particular satisfaction of a thing well done for a purpose that matters. The next chapter of my life, well, that's a different kind of quiet. There is a kind of grief that organizes itself around food. I don't think I understood this before Frank died. I understood that meals are social, that eating alone is different from eating with someone, and that the difference is larger than the mere presence of another body at the table. But I didn't understand until I was cooking for one that the grief can live in the recipes themselves. I made Frank's favourite pot roast 3 weeks after he died. I don't know entirely why. Something between habit and tribute, perhaps. I got the piece of meat, the onions, the carrots, the potatoes, the beef broth I always used. I cooked it for 3.5 hours the way I always had, and it smelled exactly right, and I ate 1 serving at the kitchen table and put the rest in the refrigerator, and I ate it for the next 4 days. I cannot recommend making your deceased husband's favourite dish as a grief strategy, but I also cannot recommend against it. It was what I did, and it served some purpose I couldn't name, and then I stopped doing it after a while and found other ways to cook for one. The apartment, when I moved to it, had a kitchen smaller than anything I'd used since the rented house in 1952. I spent several weeks learning its particular dimensions, the counter space, the storage, the particular way the light came in the window over the sink in the morning. Getting to know a kitchen is like getting to know a person. It takes time, and you have to pay attention, and at first, you are always reaching for something that turns out to be in a different place than you'd assumed. Ruth helped me set up the kitchen in the new apartment. She is a practical person, like her grandmother, and she organized the cabinets with a logic that I would never have arrived at myself, but that I have used ever since because it turns out to be correct. The things you use every day at arm's reach, the things you use less often on the higher shelves, the things you keep for company in the back of the lowest cabinet where they are accessible but not in the way. James brought a hanging plant for the kitchen window, a pothos that has survived 30 years of my irregular care, and that I still have, impossibly green and trailing, as evidence that some things are more resilient than they appear. Caro brought her grandmother's wooden spoon, the one that had stood in the crock on the counter at the Maple Street house for 30 years, and set it in the crock I'd already put on the counter in the new kitchen. The spoon has a crack in the handle that has been there since 1971. I notice it every time I use it. I was in the apartment kitchen the first morning after moving in, and I stood at the window with my coffee and looked out at the street, a different street than any street I'd ever looked at from a kitchen, and I thought about all the kitchens, the farmhouse kitchen with the monarch stove and the blue and white linoleum, the rented house with the gas stove that surprised me, the Maple Street kitchen with the yellow linoleum and the breakfast nook, and now this one, smaller and newer and beginning to become mine. 4 kitchens in a life. 4 rooms where I stood at the stove 3 times a day and made food appear for the people I loved. And 1 kitchen in Newport, well, many kitchens in Newport, underground, invisible, staffed by people whose names are not in any book I've read, the hidden kitchen and the visible one, the one that counted and the one that didn't. My mother would have had something practical to say about all of this. She would have said that the food was the same, that what mattered was that people got fed, and she would have been right in the way that she was always practically right. But she also would have known, she did know because I told her, that it mattered who was seen and who was not, that the 40-foot corridor was not just an architectural feature, but a statement about whose labor was real. She thought about it for a long time when I told her, sitting in her kitchen at the pine table, the electric range humming faintly behind us. "Work shouldn't be hidden," she said. "Work is honest." It is. It always has been. It just took 100 years for the people at the top of the stairs to start saying so out loud. And I'm still here, in my small apartment kitchen, saying it, still making the bean soup, still using the wooden spoon with the cracked handle, still watching the light come through the window in the morning and feeling, even now, at 92, the particular satisfaction of a kitchen that knows it's there. I am 92, or near enough. I live now in a small apartment, 3 rooms, which is more than I need, and a kitchen that is the smallest I've had since the rented house in 1952. But I am perhaps better equipped in it than I've been in any kitchen I've owned, having, over 70 years of cooking, acquired exactly the tools I need and gotten rid of everything else. A soup pot, a cast iron skillet I've had since 1968, a Dutch oven, 3 good knives, a wooden spoon that has been repaired twice and that I am not going to retire. The stove is electric. The children wanted me to get an induction cooktop, which is apparently very safe and very efficient, and they may be right, but I have cooked on electric burners my whole adult life, and I am not going to change at 92. Some things you decide, and that's the end of it. I cook simple things now. Soup, still, always soup, my mother's habit, and her mother's before her. Eggs in various preparations. Fish, which I've eaten more of as I've gotten older. Occasionally, when the grandchildren come, I'll make something more ambitious, a pot roast, a baked chicken, and the kitchen fills with that smell of something slow cooking, and the grandchildren, who are teenagers now and not easily impressed, will come and stand in the kitchen doorway in a way I recognize immediately. They are doing what I did, what my children did. They are being drawn by the smell. That particular pull toward warmth, toward food, toward the room where things are being made, is one of the most consistent things I've observed in a long life of observing people. It doesn't diminish with sophistication or age or exposure to other kinds of food in other kinds of places. Caro's daughter Megan went to culinary school in New York and can cook things I can't name in French, and she still stands in the doorway of my apartment kitchen when I'm making pot roast and breathes in with that same expression. Home. The word on her face without the word. The Newport cottages are museums now, most of them. You can walk through the breakers, through Marble House, through Rosecliff and Ochre Court. The Preservation Society has done careful work on them. The rooms maintained as close to their original state as possible, the furnishings documented and preserved. Hundreds of thousands of people visit each year, walking through the dining rooms and the drawing rooms and the marble halls, trying to imagine what it was to live that way. And if you find the stairs to the service wing, you can see the kitchens too. Those long rooms with the copper pots green with age and the heavy ranges cold now, never used. The dumbwaiter shafts, the long corridors. You can see where the work happened, quiet now, no longer hidden, visible at last to anyone who wants to look. Most visitors don't spend as much time in the kitchens as in the drawing rooms. I understand why. The drawing rooms are spectacular. The kitchens are functional. They have no gilt ceilings, no imported marble, no paintings worth millions of dollars. But I always went to the kitchen. I've been to the breakers 3 times now, and each time I've spent the most time in the kitchen, standing there, looking at what it was. What I understand now, that I didn't understand when I was a girl hearing Miss Caldwell mention those 70 rooms, that I didn't understand when I was a young mother reading about it at my kitchen table, that I didn't fully understand even when Frank and I stood on the cliff walk and looked at the backs of those grand houses. The Newport kitchen question was never really about kitchens. It was about which women's lives counted and which ones were made to disappear. The hostesses in their silk gowns, their lives counted. The food that appeared at their tables, the elegance of the service, the quality of the dinner that was attributed to them, to their taste and their management. They received the credit for something they hadn't done because the alternative, acknowledging who had done it, would have been too uncomfortable. It would have required seeing the people in the basement kitchen as people. The women in the basement kitchens, the cooks and kitchen maids and scullery girls, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland and Germany and Italy and Eastern Europe, many of them women whose names are not in any book I've read, their lives did not count in that accounting. Their labour was invisible by design. They were what you were not supposed to see. The architecture of the house itself said so. If you have to go underground to do it, it doesn't count. My mother's labour was not invisible. I saw it. I measured it. I have been measuring it all my life, and the accounting I've done includes the flour sacks and the ration books and the bean soup and the letters to Tommy and the Sunday pot roast and every meal on that blue and white linoleum floor for 40 years. I am the inheritor of that labour, and I have tried to pass something of it on. Caro has it, the thing my mother had, the quality of presence in a kitchen, the absorption. Ruth has a version of it, practical and steady. James grills things enthusiastically in the summer and calls it cooking, which I let pass. Megan has it most strongly of the grandchildren, that culinary school education resting on something older, something she absorbed from Caro, and that Caro absorbed from me, and that I absorbed from my mother in the kitchen in Millhaven, the flour sack in the corner, the monarch stove. The things that pass through families without being formally transmitted, the posture at the stove, the particular motion of levelling flour with a knife, the way you know when bread is ready not by looking at it, but by how the kitchen smells. What I want to say, if you're still awake, if you've stayed with me this long. The kitchen is not small, it is not lesser, it is not a place to be hidden underground or treated as something that people of a certain class should not be seen to know about. A kitchen is where the work happens, and the work is the honest thing, and the honest thing is the real thing, and the real thing is what sustains. My mother knew this. Mrs. Henderson down the road knew it. Mrs. Kowalski, with her 40-year-old sourdough starter brought from Krakow, knew it. All the women who have ever stood at a stove 3 times a day, every day, making food appear for the people they loved, they knew it. It was the Newport hostesses who didn't know it, who were arranged by the architecture of their world into a comfortable ignorance of it. And the women who cooked in the Newport kitchens knew it perhaps most of all, because they knew where the food came from and what it cost and whose hands were in it, and none of it was invisible to them. I don't say this to condemn anyone. I say it because it seems important still, after all these years, because I've been thinking about it since I was 6 years old in a one-room schoolhouse in Ohio, and something in me responded to the image of a hidden kitchen with a question that took 86 years to answer. Tonight, this kitchen, this lamp, the rain on the roof, the soup pot washed and on the rack. I made bean soup for supper, navy beans with a smoked ham hock, an onion, the dried herbs I keep in small tins on the pantry shelf, a soup my mother would have recognized immediately, a soup that is, in some direct way, the soup she made every winter of my childhood, adapted to one person and a smaller pot, but fundamentally unchanged. I ate it with bread from the bakery 3 blocks away because I'm 92 and I've earned the right to buy bread if I want to. My mother would understand. She'd have bought it too if there'd been a good bakery 3 blocks from the farmhouse in Millhaven. She was practical above all things. The cottages at Newport were magnificent. They were also, in some important ways, untrue. They were the fiction that wealth tells itself, that beauty can be separated from labour, that food can exist without cooking, that a life can be organised around invisible foundations and remain solid. The foundations were never invisible. The women in the basement kitchens were always there. The labour was always there, only the acknowledgement was missing. The grandchildren, when they were small, used to ask me to tell them about the house in Millhaven. Not the Newport story, they heard that later, when they were old enough for it, but the farmhouse itself. The monarch stove, the blue and white linoleum, the braided rug. I told them the same stories I've been telling you tonight, and they listened with the concentrated attention that children give to stories about the distant past, which is a different kind of attention from the one they give to stories about themselves. Ruth's oldest, a girl named Diane, who is now in her 40s and living in Vermont, asked me once what the hardest thing was about growing up in the Depression. I thought about it seriously before answering because she was asking seriously and deserved a serious answer. I said, the uncertainty. Not the poverty itself, which was the daily texture of things, but the uncertainty under it. The sense that the ground might shift at any moment, that what you had today might not be there tomorrow. The pantry being full in October was not just a comfort. It was a necessity, a hedge against that uncertainty, a small assertion that tomorrow would have something in it. Diane thought about this. Then she said, "Is that why you always cook too much?" And I laughed because yes, it probably is. The bowl always slightly too full, the pot always slightly too large, the pantry, even now in this 3-room apartment, always slightly overstocked for what one person could realistically eat. My mother's pantry, transplanted into an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Ohio in 2024. The Newport Hostesses had no pantry. They had suppliers, arrangements with merchants, with farms, with professional provisioners who delivered what was needed for each meal. Abundance was continuous and assumed. The larder was conceptual. The actual food arrived when it was needed, and from directions the family did not inquire about. I cannot imagine that feeling. The pantry is one of the organizing facts of my relationship to food. The knowledge of what's there, what's running low, what I'll need to buy on Thursday. I made a list this morning. I do this every week on Sunday. Walk through the kitchen and see what I have and what I need. It takes perhaps 10 minutes. It is as natural as breathing. I wrote dried beans, bread, the good cheese, eggs, the small amount of butter I still permit myself, an onion, some apples, because the fall ones are in and they are very good this year, crisp and not too sweet, the kind you can eat out of hand without thinking about it. I will go to the store on Monday afternoon when it is least crowded. I will push my cart slowly through the aisles and choose what I've listed and occasionally something I didn't list because it looks particularly good. I will carry the bags up 3 flights of stairs. The elevator is slow and I can still do stairs, which I consider an achievement and a responsibility both, and I will put everything away in the order that makes sense, the way I've been doing it for 70 years. This is my life, not the grand version of anything, not the marble dining room or the 40-foot corridor or the invisible hands. Just this, a kitchen, a list, a store on Monday, the soup on the stove, the lamp on in the evening when the rain comes in. I have had a good life. I want to say that plainly because I think it gets lost sometimes in stories about difficult times, the Depression winters, the war years, Frank's death, the years of adjustment after. Those things happened. They were real. But around them, and through them, and after them, there has been a life that I would choose again. The kitchen in Millhaven, Frank at the table, Ruth and James and Caro making their way in the world, the grandchildren arriving to the smell of pot roast, this apartment, this lamp, this soup pot clean and on the rack. I hope, wherever you are listening to this, that you have something like that. A room that knows you, a practice that is yours, a bowl that is slightly too full because someone once taught you that it should be. I'm glad to have a kitchen that knows me. I'm glad for the soup pot and the cast iron skillet and the wooden spoon. I'm glad for my mother's example, which is the most valuable thing she gave me. And I'm glad for this evening, this long thought I've been having since I was 6 years old. At last something like resolved. The rain is still going, the lamp is on, the kitchen is quiet. There's a part of this story that still surprises me when I think about it. The part where I realize, over and over, that the women who did the work are the ones who understood what it was for, that labor and love are not separable, not really in a kitchen or anywhere else, that the visible life and the hidden life were never 2 different lives. They were always one, and the hidden part was always the foundation of the visible part, and you can't have the one without the other. 92 years, an Ohio farmhouse kitchen, a grain elevator in a small Ohio town, 3 children, their children, bean soup, still. I should let you sleep now. You've stayed with me a long time tonight, through the farmhouse and the Depression winters and the radio and the ration books and Newport, through the marriage and the children and the years that came after. That's a long life to sit beside, and I'm grateful for your company." The rain is still going. It has settled into an even sound now, the way rain does when it has decided to stay a while. There's a certain peace in that sound. It closes the world in. It makes the lamp feel warmer. It makes this room, this small room with the kitchen at one end and the chair at the other and the lamp between them, feel like the only room that exists tonight. Rest now, if you can. Let the rain take the edges off things. Let the thoughts that have been running all day begin to slow, the way water slows when it reaches still ground. You don't need to hold on to anything tonight. Everything will be there in the morning. I'm going to sit here a little while longer. I often do, in the evenings. I'll watch the lamp and listen to the rain and let my mind go wherever it wants to go. Back to the blue and white linoleum floor, back to the maple tree turning all at once in October, back to the cliff walk at Newport with the ocean grey below and the great houses rising above. All of it held in here now in 92 years of an Ohio woman's life, quiet and mostly glad. Quiet and mostly glad. That's not a small thing. That's what I would wish for anyone. The rain on the roof, the lamp on the table, the soup pot washed and on the rack. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. The kitchen is dark now. I turned the light off when I finished washing up, the way I always do. I don't like to leave lights on in rooms I'm not using, which is one of those Depression-era habits that has simply never left me, but I can see it from here, in the dark, the shape of it. The window above the sink and the faint ambient light of the street coming through, enough to see the outlines of things. The soup pot on the rack, the wooden spoon in the crock, the hanging plant that James brought me 30 years ago, still green and trailing in the window. I know that kitchen in the dark the way you know the face of someone you love, by the shape of things, not the details, by where they are without having to see them. That's what a kitchen becomes finally, after enough years, not a room, a kind of knowing, a set of positions and smells and sounds that have been inscribed in you by repetition until they're as much a part of you as anything else. I carry that kitchen in me now even when I'm not in it. I carry my mother's kitchen in me too. And in some way I cannot quite explain, I carry the Newport kitchen in me, not as something I own or covet, but as a kind of question I've been working on answering my whole life. The answer I've arrived at 92, with the rain still going and the lamp still on and the night as quiet as it ever gets in a city. You're warm, I hope. You're comfortable. The night is yours. Sleep well, dear. Come back whenever the night feels long. There's always more. There's always another evening at this lamp, another chapter, another winter I can tell you about, another morning that smelled like bread. If you'd like, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what the night is like there. I do wonder about that, and if there's a part of a life you'd like to hear about next, leave it for me. I'll be here. Sleep well, dear. Come back whenever the night feels long.